Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. This series explores the enduring presence of racism and the psychoanalytic mechanisms that sustain it, drawing inspiration from key works and current research. Hosts Dr. Karyne Messina and Dr. Felicia Powell-Williams explore the complexities of racism through the lens of psychoanalysis as they foster a crucial dialogue on racial inequality. Here are your hosts.
Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America, a special series on the New Books Network. I'm Dr. Karyne Messina, your host, along with my very special co-host, Dr. Felicia Powell-Williams. In this series, we discuss how the tools and concepts of psychoanalysis might help us understand the persistent and dynamics of racism in the United States. We'll be talking to psychoanalysts, and especially Black psychoanalysts, about how to comprehend and combat racism. We hope you enjoy the series. This is episode 4, Defense Mechanisms in James Baldwin's Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, and how it relates with Dr. Martin Luther King's book, Chaos and Community. Where do we go from here? These topics are so current, and yet both books were written a number of years ago. So today, we'd like to start our podcast with a short history about a man who did something we've lost in America. James Baldwin insisted on telling the truth, and this is what I think we've lost today with so much false information. Fake news, false information, and everything that goes around the internet and on social media. Sometimes people don't know what's true. James Baldwin confronted the harsh realities of racism, believing that exposing its ugliness was necessary for progress. He rejected simplistic solutions, arguing that racism was deeply rooted in American consciousness and imagination, beyond just political and economic inequalities. Instead, Baldwin called for a fundamental transformation of American society and identity. He critiqued white America, urging white Americans to confront their own behavior and complicity in racist systems. Felicia, why don't you tell us more about this great American, very prominent writer and social critic?
Thank you, Karyne, for introducing James Baldwin. There's so much more that we can talk about in regards to his contributions to literature and just to society. Just to give a little brief history, James Baldwin, I'm using my notes here because definitely don't want to leave anything out because he has contributed so much to us. But he was born on August 2nd in 1924 in Harlem, New York. And what's really interesting about this is that his mother, she left the South because she wanted to find a community that was less segregated and riddled with the racial discrimination that she was experiencing. And at age 19, she left home and she ended up in Harlem, New York. And once she was there, she met her husband. After becoming a parent, she met her husband, who was a Baptist preacher and was also a laborer. And he was such an inspiration in the sense that he really is woven into some of James Baldwin's earlier works in many of the characters. But it's really important for us to just really keep in mind that his drive and his determination to bring forth and help society confront much of what was happening then, which is what's happening now, really started with a seed that was planted by his mother. So I want to also note here that James Baldwin did advocate for Black Americans, much to approach white countrymen with love, he promoted love in general. But he also, as you said, Karyne, he promoted truth. He went into the world and existed in the world with his eyes wide open. There was nothing that he presented that was false or was untruth to his eyes, to his lens. And he wanted us to see exactly what was in front of us. And much of that, as spoken earlier, is woven into the works that he has provided for us over the generations. I'll stop there and see if there's a little bit more you want to add about James Baldwin.
Well, I'm so struck by his ability and insistence on truth-telling. And so sad that we've lost that in America today. How do we get it back? It also got to him. In 1948, he went to Paris because he thought he would have more freedom as a writer and create the creative person he was. And he was right about that. He did have more freedom.
He did. He did. Thank you for bringing that up, because we did hear of many artists who left the country during that time and traveled abroad. Even Josephine Baker was another person of color who left and found more of an artistic freedom, more of a social and racial acceptance in France. And so it was unfortunate, but it was true. So as you talk about the difficulty with truth, it is interesting how we are now still sitting with the reality that truth-telling seems to be almost, a lost art. And we're in a time, even in a political system, where everything is about what's true and what's not. And so he brings this up in one of his works that is often presented in psychoanalytic circles, in curriculums, and teaching trainees and candidates, about his letter to his nephew. And it was such a beautiful letter that what he tells his nephew is what to prepare for the truth that he needs to see, so that he's not navigating himself through the world without knowing what's really there. And not only what to see, but how to prepare himself for the emotions that he was going to be experiencing, and how to hold them, and how to be mindful that others around him may not experience what he experienced and may not be willing to hold what he would hold, and respect what he was experiencing as well. And that's happening for us today. And so I applaud you for bringing up that really fundamental piece of his work, and especially, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about some of the specific literature of James, but the whole piece of truth-telling. We could talk about storytelling because he was a beautiful storyteller, but he was also a truth-teller.
Yes, it's critically important, and as we both said, it has been lost. It's such a shame that we sometimes can become angry with people in the other political party.
Mm-hmm.
But often people don't know what to believe. They believe what an influencer says because they like the person, or they believe what the person has to say, or a political figure. But often people just don't know. They don't know what's true, so they follow this one or that one. It's hard to learn what is actually true. I do want to mention these books or I want to show these books because they're really important. James Baldwin's Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone is a very significant and important book. I also want to remind people about another book that is so very current. It's as if it were written out last week. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? What could be more relevant than that? I don't know too many more relevant.
You're right. You're right, Karyne. Right now where we are in this country and probably in the state of the world, where do we go from here? Every day we hear of some type of disruption within systems. We hear of destruction of countries. We hear the pain that is riddled through war. And we also hear the pain that comes from all of the racism and the difficulty with being able to accept difference. And I keep in mind that one of the things that James Baldwin wanted to see happen is a nation that could be able to think together, and to think together in such a way of how we might be able to be with each other and accept our differences. He really wanted us to confront, as a country, not only looking at racial discrimination, but he wanted us to look at, the whole concept of masculinity. He wanted us to just look at social injustice. There were so many things there. And when we think about Martin Luther King's book, you and I, we've talked about this. I think we've talked about it in a couple of our episodes, looking at the chaos and the chaos that we're existing in. But also, how do we get to a place of community? And is it as easy as what Dr. Martin Luther King shared with us? And what community could look like and what it would take? Could it be that easy? Could it be that accepting? And that's a big question for us to continue to think about. Thank you for bringing that in. And it's definitely worth us talking about today and any other episode that we continue to work within, because this is something that we live through each and every day.
Absolutely. It's so interesting that Dr. Martin Luther King wrote a nonfiction book, and James Baldwin here wrote a book of fiction. And yet,
yes,
where we come out in the end it's in a very similar place. So that's where we end up. So I would like to mention some of the defense mechanisms that James Baldwin talked about through his characters. And there are three distinct types. One is individual denial. This comes through with his protagonist, Leo Proudhammer, who engages in a denial as a way of preserving himself, self-preservation.
Mm-hmm.
He illustrates through Leo's relationship with Barbara. Well, Barbara was a white friend of his from, I don't know about aristocracy, but from a wealthy family. And, he was not.
That's right.
Leo's fear of commitment stems from a deeper denial of his own desires and capabilities. He refused to acknowledge, as I recall, the possibility of a lasting relationship, using the fear of alienation as a shield against vulnerability that comes from genuine connection. And we all know about that. It's hard to connect. We want to be a part of a community, and it's crucially important to be part of a community. And yet it isn't that easy. It isn't always that easy, for sure. So this type of denial serves as a protective mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of his book on fiction, it allows Leo to avoid confronting his own insecurities and, I might add, past traumas. So that's one kind of denial that's mentioned in the book. Is societal denial. Why don't you tell us about societal denial as he shares with us in this book, because it's really important. It isn't in all psychoanalytic literature. It certainly isn't in psychoanalytic literature under that name, but yet it is extremely important. It's a collective type of denial, and it's reflected in the attitudes of white characters who fail to recognize their own prejudices and privileges afforded to them by the way they exist in the social structure. White people don't want to say, I'm prejudiced.
That's right.
Person to person, they just don't want to admit it.
I think it's hard for many to admit that there are these threads of isms that we carry with us. These are things that have been internalized from ways in which our own family culture has been influenced by societal culture. It has been influenced in ways in which we as people need to survive. So when we start to talk about societal denial, we have to also keep in mind that, it's so relevant in racial relations. And when we think about that, especially in Baldwin's work, that it's portrayed that society refuses to acknowledge its history. And that's what we experience today, that this is a country that was founded on racism. It was founded on division. It was founded on so many pieces because people came to this country out of a need to survive, but also they came to this country because they were not accepted from where they were migrating from. So it's really important for us to keep that, relevant in our discussion, but also the history of racial oppression, the ongoing impact of systemic racism. Those are threads that will continue to linger from generations to generations. And it's beautiful how James Baldwin keeps us reminded. And I've mentioned this to you oftentimes, Karyne, that James writes, or he wrote in a way in which he was writing to us right now.
Absolutely.
He was so beautifully able to illustrate the important pieces of societal denial to where it leaves you wondering, is he still with us? Even Martin Luther King, is he still with us in his work? And knowing, of Dr. King's tragic death, knowing that we have James Baldwin who died in 1987, it's just so interesting that what they've presented to us still lingers. And it lingers in such relevant ways as if they're writing to us today. So I wanted to bring that up in regards to societal denial. But we could continue to talk about this. And I think many of our listeners can really relate to ways in which societal denial presents itself on many levels.
Absolutely. You couldn't be more on the money. I think a good thing that might follow this is something else he talked about it, and I've sort of talked about it as the third type of denial. What he challenges us all to do is confront our own denial.
Yeah.
Suggesting that true personal and societal growth can only occur when we are free to face uncomfortable truths. He said the artist's role is to break through the layers of denial, exposing the questions that lie hidden beneath the superficial answers. That's beautiful. I think I'm going to read that again because I think it's so important. Exposing the questions that lie hidden beneath superficial answers, and force both individuals and society to confront realities that we would all rather ignore. It's easier to ignore things, in so many ways, turn our heads the other way. If you witness an accident and you see that someone's clearly at fault, it's easy for people to just say, well, I'm sure that so-and-so down the street, I see that that person is out there. They'll report it. They'll tell the truth about what they saw. That person can easily just go back into their home or shut the curtains. But it's important to go out there and speak one's truth. What did you see? If you saw something that was wrong, say it. Don't hide. Say it.
That's easily said than done.
I know.
I think one of the phrases that we all hear in our lives is that truth really hurts. It hurts to hear it. And oftentimes we don't want to hear the truth. We don't want to see the truth. And what I appreciate in this body of work that you've presented from James Baldwin, it resonates with me in a parallel to his letter to his nephew. And that is, as much as we don't want to look at what's really there, the truth is it's there. And the truth is it's painful. And that's what we experience oftentimes, is that resistance to pain. And we see this in our consulting rooms, is that we tend to bury the pain. And when we bury the pain, we defend against so much and try to use other things to bring in to keep us away from the pain. And sometimes ways in which we bury the pain is how we begin to believe what's really not true, how we begin to see things that are really not there, and how we begin to hear things that are really not being said. So this is really a lovely piece for us to think about, and that is how painful it is to sit with the truth. Now, on the other end, there is a freeing that, as you introduced earlier, truth can set you free. That's another phrase. The truth can set you free. I done heard that from my mother. I done heard it from my father. I hear it from people with wisdom. I hear it from myself. The truth can set you free. And so when we sit with the truth and we free ourselves from those individual and societal and even collective denial components, it's really important that we sit with that and see how we can hold it long enough. So in holding it, knowing that we can tolerate the pain so that we could move through the journey as effectively and as much as we can with our eyes wide open.
Yes, that reminds me of something that I think about so often in our psychoanalytic institutes, in the world in general, with patients and with friends. And I think that people, I've come to think over the years that people are adverse to conflict. And I think looking the other way has a lot to do with being afraid to say, this is what I saw. This is what I know to be true. This is my truth. It's hard to do that, and yet so vitally important. For Baldwin, overcoming denial, societal and individual, was crucial for progress. And I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. Not so eloquently as he said it, but say it nevertheless. I do think that's tied into being adverse to conflict. Because if you're adverse to conflict, you can't tell your own truth or anybody else's truth. Not sure you can do that anyway, but your perception of somebody else's truth. So he called for honest examination and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And that's again what we're talking about. People are afraid to do that quite often. I don't think everybody is mean-spirited or they're intentionally trying to lie. There are a number of people around who do that, but I don't think other people do that intentionally, or all people do that intentionally. I think it's anxiety and fear of what will happen to them, and what will happen is they'll feel good, actually.
Yeah.
Feel relieved. It's as if a huge burden has been lifted. It's as if a 50-pound weight is gone.
Yes.
But people don't know that until they try it. And it takes a long time to make that move or to take that first step. And that's one thing that we do in psychoanalysis. And that's why it takes a fair amount of time, because it's as if you have to work up the courage by understanding yourself with the help of another person to be able to take that first step.
That's true. That is very true.
Only by moving past this denial can America begin to answer its deep-rooted racial issues, political issues, and all this false news and fake information. I mixed the order of that on purpose because it's the same thing. So these are very important books. I hope people, if they haven't read them, I hope they do read them. And I hope they refresh their memories about them by taking them out. And if you haven't read them for a while, dust them off. If dust is accumulated, it tends to accumulate in this area pretty quickly. And read them again, because there's so much that can be said, so much that can we learn from these two books. Where do we go from here? As we both said or implied, it could have been published last month. And the same is true in a novel, which is quite different in terms of style, but tell me how long the train's been gone.
That's
very
right.
Similar, very current messages. There's so many other defense mechanisms that we could talk about with regard to these two books. Projective identification, one of my favorites. But Maybe we'll weave that into one of our talks.
Our preparation for today's podcast, I think, was helpful because for me, it led me to think about, many of the other works of James Baldwin. And as you were talking about, taking some of these books off the shelf, and dusting them off, I did just that. I took off the shelf my book, Going to Meet the Man. And this is such a beautiful book, and it was gifted to me by my parents. And it was one of the first Baldwin books that was shared with me because my parents said that this was really important. This is important, and you beginning to hold, this literary genius in mind. Because oftentimes within the education system, my parents would always share that I may not see others that look like me, that might not be taught. And so it was important to make sure that I knew that there were others who wrote and who spoke out that looked like me. And so I thank them for presenting that to me in such a beautiful way. And, it takes me back to how I mentioned keeping our eyes wide open in Baldwin's letter to his nephew and my parents, words to me, but also connecting to Martin Luther King. Where do we go from here? How do we build community? And we build community, as he says, it's just being honest and being truthful that this is what we have. And how do we build and how do we preserve? And we do that collaboratively, much like what you and I are doing here in this podcast, is that we're coming from two different entities and how we have navigated our way through the world and what was given to us and what we began to create for ourselves and how we began to think and bring that here and hopefully to open up other ways of thinking for our listeners. And, this is such a lovely way for us to really begin to take that walk. And where do we go from here? Do we just think about it? I think thinking is helpful. And in the analytic consulting room, we do think about many things. And oftentimes, where do we go from that moment of thinking? Do we take action? Do we continue to leave the space open to think? Or do we, tend to do what we've been talking about all day? Do we deny and defend? There's so many things there. And Dr. King made sure that we talk about the reality of society, the financial, the economics of it, the community resources that are needed. How do we understand family and support family in those ways? So there's many things that culturally may be diverse, but still should be supported. So, I'll stop there, Karyne. I'm just, there's so much rambling through my mind right now that is so relevant to where we are today, but I need to stop because I do want to hear from you. And I know that the listeners also want to hear from you and how you're thinking about this as well.
Well, what I think is, in addition to thinking, I think we need to talk. We need to talk
communication
between, right, between and among ourselves. And there's so many ways to do that. Two friends can talk about a book. Book clubs are great. Just meetings, impromptu meetings. I for many years keep this very close. I have different areas where I keep my books, and I keep this in the closest area to my bedroom where I do a lot of work at night. So I can just grab it and say, yes, I know there's something here that relates to what I'm writing about. And this, it's a novel, it's different, but it's also extremely helpful. There's so many good passages in this book that are so illuminating that they relate to just about everything that's happening. I write books about politics. It relates to both books relate so well to what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad, I'm touched that your parents gave you such a wonderful book. And I imagine that that's close to your heart. And now it's off the shelf. So you can
Yes.
I can buy your bedstand, maybe. So I think there's so much. We could talk for a very long time about these two books, and we will continue to talk about them in the future in other podcasts, which we're doing once a month. They're not always at the same time once a month, but every month we're doing one. So we hope that you join us again, and hope that this will get you started if you haven't started already, and many of you I'm sure have. But I hope that this gets you started in thinking about these two people and reading or rereading the wonderful things they have to say. Profound things, current things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, until next time.
Until next time.
Felicia, and thank you for listening.